This is U.S. History 2, Chapter 10, Section 2. World War II begins in Europe. So by the mid-1930s, Europe had three dictators, as we discussed in the last section. Germany had Adolf Hitler, Italy had Benito Mussolini, and the Soviet Union had Joseph Stalin, all with the goal of expanding their empire for their country. Japan had already started creating their new empire by invading China in 1931, and then continued on to dominate other Asian countries. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's plan was to bring glory back to Italy. He started developing a new army, started making war supplies instead of consumer goods, with the goal of reforming the old Roman Empire by dominating the Mediterranean Sea and the Middle East. In 1935, he invaded the African country of Ethiopia because from a previous war they had lost their colony there. They sought to take it back, and they did quite easily. Ethiopia's leaders asked the League of Nations for aid against the invasion, but the League of Nations was very weak because the United States did not join. Therefore, they received little help. Italy quickly occupied Ethiopia, and now they started to begin their conquest. In Germany, Adolf Hitler started defying the Treaty of Versailles directly. Germany wasn't allowed to have more than 100,000 soldiers, according to the Treaty of Versailles, but Hitler directly went against that and started enlisting millions of soldiers. By 1936, Hitler moved soldiers into the Rhineland, the Rhineland is this area between Germany and France that no German military was allowed to enter. Hitler boldly had his new soldiers enter that area of Germany, and he said it was the most nerve-wracking 48 hours of his life because technically France and England and other Allied forces could have forced Germany out of that region because written in the treaty they weren't allowed to be there. But no such resistance came, and so the German army stayed. And then in 1938, German armies invaded and occupied Austria, which they weren't allowed to do according to the treaty as well. They started coming into this, it was called the Sudetenland. A lot of German ethnic people lived there, and Hitler wanted to take it back. France and England were growing really uncomfortable with all these moves that Hitler were making, and they called this conference in Munich to talk with Hitler and see what could be done peacefully, because they wanted to avoid another world war. France and England chose the strategy of appeasement, a hope to satisfy Hitler in his wants and demands, and hoping that he would not take any more land. Appeasement is just the policy of giving into aggression in order to avoid a war. They practice the policy of appeasement, which is the policy of giving into the aggression in order to avoid a war. So they're trying to make Hitler happy enough so they didn't have to start a world war. France and England agreed to allow Germany to take the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. In return, Germany would not invade any more territory in Europe. France and England were pleased with the Munich Agreement, so much so that Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, who met with Adolf Hitler, here's Chamberlain, here's Adolf Hitler, Mussolini was there, so was the Prime Minister of France. He came back to England and was like, said that he had won peace for our time. Only 3 months later, Hitler broke the agreement completely and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the appeasement did nothing to deter Hitler from resuming his conquest. Hitler was unfazed by trying to listen to he wasn't going to be convinced or be allowed to do something because the Allies let him. He was just going to do whatever he wanted. Another world war almost seemed imminent at that point. Hitler was not going to back down until he did whatever he wanted to do. Since the ending of World War I, the United States has been determined to stay out of European affairs. World War I kind of left a little bitter taste in a lot of Americans' mouths that we lost a lot of lives in Europe during that war. Really, for what? They just kind of bailed them out of their own war. We wanted to stay out of it, keep U.S. out. So we practiced isolationism. In 1935, though, U.S. passed the Neutrality Act, which was designed to keep the U.S. at peace with the other nations. The Neutrality Act prevented the president from selling guns, making loans, or giving any assistance to any nation involved in a war. Many Americans agreed with the U.S. government not intervening in European conflicts because they felt the government should be focused on ending the depression. How can we focus our efforts on a war when we're struggling so much at home? So ending the Great Depression was on everybody's mind in the United States by 1940 still. So a decade long. It's just terrible. But let's focus on that instead of European wars. So after Adolf Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, he wasn't satisfied. His next target was Poland. France and Britain threatened Germany with war if they invaded Poland. France and Britain pretty much had enough. They had to draw a line in the sand somewhere. Germany did not want to fight a war on two fronts like they had in World War I, which kind of weakened them greatly. He wanted to fight on one front and then move to the other. So Hitler devised a plan to ally himself with Stalin and the Soviet Union. In exchange, they would both invade Poland and split the country. Stalin surprisingly agreed. He said Stalin's a dictator, he wants more land. So he agreed to the plan with Hitler, the Non-Aggression Pact, which was a complete surprise because Germany and Russia were bitter enemies. And on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. France and England had to be true to the word. Only 2 days later, since Germany invaded Poland, they declared war on Germany and World War II officially began. 16 days after Germany began their invasion, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland. So Germany came in from the west, and then the Soviet Union came in from the east, and they're going to split Poland. So poor Poland. They did put up a fight, but didn't work out that well. Germany had developed a new strategy of war called Blitzkrieg that they used to great effect to invade Poland. Blitzkrieg is lightning war, where the strategy is to attack the enemy at their weakest point, focus all your energy there, and then keep moving and have one swift attack that had planes, tanks, and infantry all working together to exploiting that one weak point. France began securing their border with Germany, called the Maginot Line, preparing for the imminent attack by the Germans. They knew that they were going to come for France eventually. France, although was overconfident because they won World War I, they were all overconfident in themselves to defend against the German army and had not improved their army all that much since World War I, and were using kind of antiquated weaponry and tactics. England also helped France defend their border, but could have done a little bit better job. So here's the Blitzkrieg. The reason why Germans had to use Blitzkrieg was because they were outnumbered by the Allies. So they had to come up with a solution to be outnumbered. So they would focus all their attack on separating the enemy at their weak point. That's a weak point in the line, and then encircling them, cutting them off in two. You can see weakest point in the line, go right there, invade, and then push through the opening, and then you're splitting them off or encircling. So here's the French line. So the French thought they were going to attack here. This is where they put strong fortifications, but France forgot to put strong fortifications right here because of their border with Belgium. So that this is Germany. They thought these countries would be a good border or a buffer zone. That's why right here, that's France, it's Germany. This is France, have Belgium in between. They thought they'd be a little safer. Fortifications not that great, but that was their downfall. Using Blitzkrieg strategy, the German army quickly found the weak spot in the French defense and started their attack. The French didn't think to fortify this heavily wooded area on the French and German border called the Ardennes. It was a hilly, rocky place, forested. They didn't think the German army would go in there, but that's exactly where the German army went. And that's how they entered into France, go through the Ardennes. They were able to swiftly get into France territory and flank the British and French armies. And so, because of the speed and coordination of the Germans, France and England were forced to retreat to the port city called Dunkirk. And at Dunkirk, the British army was able to be rescued from destruction. Because England had sent all these ships over, including merchant ships, to bring back these soldiers to England. It's actually a movie called Dunkirk about this. So France surrendered on June 22nd, 1940, only 6 weeks after Germany invaded France. It was a quick move. They pretty much had done what Germany couldn't do in 6 years of World War I. Hitler accepted this surrender terms in the same exact train car that the German army surrendered to in World War I, kind of a little insult to injury. Germany now occupied all of France, and the British army had to leave, but were not completely destroyed and successfully escaped at Dunkirk. And this is Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. They completely took over France. After defeating France, the only Allied force left in Europe was England. England's Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. Germany was determined to crush England, and they deployed their air force called the Luftwaffe to perform all these relentless air raid bombings to force England into submission. Winston Churchill led the people in surviving these bomb raids, and he insisted them to be stubborn, do not give in. This is where the keep calm and carry on signs come from. They would hide in the subway tunnels at night to avoid the bombings. Children were evacuated to the countryside and avoided living in the cities. They were bombing. In the book, the Lion, Witch, in the Wardrobe, the kids, that's how they ended up in the countryside, is because London was being bombed. That's why the children are visiting, I believe, their uncle in the countryside. It was just safer for children to get out of the city. The continued air attacks were called the Battle of Britain. So here they are, hiding in the subway tunnels at night, because a lot of the bombings happening at night. This is the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force that would come in, bomb everything. And it did cause massive destruction, but the British, they just weren't going to give in to such bombings. The British Royal Air Force, although they were outnumbered, they were called to defend against England, and they were successful enough to make the Germans abandon their air raids against England. So they deterred them enough. And Winston Churchill said, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." So there were so few bombers, part of the Royal Air Force, that were able to fight away the Luftwaffe. The British people were able to outlast the German attack through the summer of 1940, and the bombings eventually stopped. And Hitler no longer planned to invade England. He kind of thought that would take too much effort and kind of took away from his ultimate goal of taking over all of Europe and eventually the world. So Winston Churchill said, We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall never surrender. And Hitler kind of realized that this would have taken too much effort, all his efforts just to do that. So he abandoned that strategy of taking over the island of England. So despite failing to conquer England, Hitler had most of Europe under his control. Italy had joined the war, allying with Germany. The only other powerful country in Europe was the Soviet Union. And so Germany had taken over much of Europe except for England. And really, he decided to go after the Soviet Union. He broke the peace agreement and invaded the Soviet Union. Remember, Hitler hated communists. They were bitter enemies, and he decided this was the time to go into Russia. The Soviet Union was unprepared for the Germans' attack, and they suffered heavy casualties. England and Soviet Union had no choice but to become allies at this point against Germany and to try to stop them. By the end of 1941, Hitler was close to dominating all of Europe and fulfilling his plans. So you can see here, he was able to take over France. Italy was an ally, and then started pushing into Russia by this point. And so this is a good time to be. This is probably his most powerful right here, and how expansive his lands got. The German army seemed kind of invincible up until this point.